What I like to do is to try to mix audiences, which is one of the aspects of my festival. Like I'd love to see, for example, in Austin, a lot more of the jazz, like the people who is listening to more mainstream jazz, to come and also listen to free jazz, because the basics are so similar. It's the traditions are the same. I mean, this been explored for for decades already. It's time for people to see the commonalities.
This time on 20 Minutes into the Future, free jazz bassist Ingebright Haker Flaten joins John Lebakowski and Scoop Sweeney in the Plutopia Virtual Studio.
Welcome to the Plutopia News Network. We're speaking today with Ingebright Haker Flaten, a prolific jazz bassist originally from Norway, currently based in Austin, Texas. He's lived in the U.S. since 2006. But he's really based in the whole world, touring a lot in Europe as well as in the U.S. Ingebright is a jazz performer, and jazz has no borders. Ingebright started in the 1990s playing jazz in public, and he's known to be one of the hardest working bassists in jazz and improv music, free jazz, constantly touring worldwide and appearing on more than 150 albums so far as both sideman and leader. Ingebright has for many years been recognized as both an acoustic and electric bass player in Downbeat magazine's annual critics poll. And he's worked with bands like The Thing, Atomic, Free Fall, Scorch Trio, Sunrooms, Dave Rempis Percussion Quartet, I.P.A, Icepick, Bick, as well as his own bands, Young Mothers and IHF Chicago Sextet. And he's also worked in duo formats with Joe McPhee, Evan Parker, Håkon Kornstad. And all this has put him at the center of a large pool of improvisers that work in strikingly different ways. Ingebright has performed and recorded with a number of world-acclaimed other musicians, such as James Blood Ulmer, Chick Corea, Yusef Lateef, Neneh Cherry, Joe McPhee. I do also want to mention, though, that Ingebright is the founder and artistic director of the Great Sonic Transmissions Festival, which is an annual festival in Austin, Texas, focused on really eclectic music, especially free jazz. And he's also the co-founder of the record label Tektite Records Co-Operative. So Ingebright, did you start with jazz, or didn't you play more like funk in the beginning?
Well, I was starting off like coming from a family that had a lot of musical bond to the more church traditions. My father was an organ player. My mother was a singer in church. So my first like playing an instrument was actually in a choir at home, my home village, playing electric bass. So that was the early start of just getting the feeling of playing. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that you had played with the choir.
Yeah. No, my whole family have a really strong connection to that tradition. So I was really brought up around that.
So was your dad the church organist for that?
Yeah, he was an organ player. He was also a cellist. But he had to take over the farm, so he had to cancel. He was still an organ player, but his main occupation was a farmer.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Did you sing with the choir, or did you just play?
No, I guess I was singing it sometimes, but I was never really a good singer.
So you started playing bass. Why did you pick bass over other instruments?
Well, yeah, me and my twin brother started off playing more classical piano. We went to a teacher, I think, around like 8, 9, 10 years old. I remember I never got the feeling, and I quit shortly after. And I tried guitar. It didn't either do anything for me at that point, at least. So it was more like coincidental. I think they needed the electric bass in that choir, and I got some lessons from the original bass player And he played Michael Jackson Thriller for me, and I learned the bass line, and I just got this immediate feeling like, wow, this is what I want to do. Like this immediate kind of vibe. Yeah.
That's a good starting point there. It could have been something horrible that would have derailed you rather than inspired you.
Exactly right. Yeah, no.
Now you play a lot of, at least from what I've seen of your performances, stand-up bass. How did you make that transition from the electric?
Well, I started studying. I got into the jazz conservatory in Trondheim in Norway University, and leading up to that, I was studying with an acoustic bass player. That the first kind of early stages with him, I played electric bass, but I was really drawn to the acoustic, and I wanted to learn that, and he got me going on acoustic for sure. He was an extremely talented bass player, so he played a lot of the old school jazz bass for me, and I just got hooked. So that, and I got in. I was accepted at the conservatory, and I studied acoustic bass mostly. Yeah.
Hey, do you ever play other instruments? I mean, today?
Well, I don't consider myself playing. I mean, I learned the piano when I was at the conservatory, but I never kept it up. So I always say that I only play bass. That's the only thing I really can do.
Do you compose?
Yeah, I love composing. It's something that I love to do much more. But it's something that, yeah, it's a time-consuming thing, but it's a great thing to do for so many reasons. And I love doing it.
Do you use the piano when you're composing, or still primarily just thinking in terms of bass?
Right. No, I try not to think in terms of bass. It's more like I can come up with starting points, like lines, melodic lines, and I like to just treat them. I use a lot just Sibelius digital tool, and I compose and try to experiment with different solutions and hear how it sounds and work out from that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like Charles Mingus.
Yeah.
I recently saw a documentary about Mingus, and there were some shots of his compositions, the actual sheet music, I mean, as he wrote it out himself, and it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
No, he's. I mean, that's he was a heavy composer, and he drawn inspiration from a lot of the classical, and I mean, he was so far ahead of his time. His music is incredible. I love it.
So I'm assuming Mingus was one influence. Who else has influenced you? And I mean, both early on and over time.
Right. Oh, it's so many. It always, when I get that question, I get a little bit stuck because it's so many. But I can always, I like to mention my early on acoustic bass, which was this Danish bass player Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen, or Nup, how they call him in the US. I think more it's he played with Dexter Gordon and Bud Powell and all these cats when he was 17, 18, an extremely talented bass player, and he kind of set the tradition in Scandinavia for extremely high level skills playing acoustic bass. And one of the first albums I heard of him was a duo album, Archie Chep and him. Uh-huh. And my first bass teacher, he got me to learn most of the bass lines and like walking lines accompanying Archie Chep, and also his solos. So I learned a lot of that, and that got me started in a way. And then started conservatory, digging into like a whole bunch, like Paul Chambers, Sam Jones, and of course Scott LaFaro, Charlie Hayden, of course, Ron Carter. It's so many that influenced me heavily, and I was really digging deep to those years at the conservatory, for sure.
Can you say a little bit about like jazz in Norway? Was it a big thing when you were starting out, or has it kind of grown over the years?
Yeah, I think Norway's kind of an exceptional state in that sense. For many reasons, it's hard to pinpoint what, but it's always been a very individual voice here. And it had the school I was studying started in '79 on a model of much more the audible teaching model, more than the visual, like you learn sheet music and that's how it is. It's much more based on the learning something by ear, like the ear training part, which of course all jazz and music schools have, but this school was like very much centered around that. And I think that have done a lot to the scene. And then, of course, you cannot not think of people like Jan Garbarek, John Christensen, Irelanders, and Teddy Dybdahl, like key figures in the Norwegian jazz from the 70s that was part of establishing the ECM label back in the days.
Oh yeah,
and they made such an impact on Norway, the jazz musicians, and it's always been it's been a high level of like the jazz, been very important for a long time, and it's been a lot of good players.
Well, players from the United States have always looked at Europe and Scandinavia as a place where they can be accepted, where they're perhaps less accepted in the States. And I've seen many people who actually got their careers on track by going away from the United States and going overseas to Europe, to Scandinavia.
Yeah, for sure, which is mostly also based on the financial model. There's no way you can survive playing a non-commercial art form in the US. There just isn't money for it. So there is no like willingness to support arts and music that's not commercially driven. And that's the big difference. Like in Europe and Scandinavia especially, the government supports arts and music that have no, I mean, of course there is ticket sales involved, there's money involved, but it's just not commercial music. And it's always been support for it, so both clubs and musicians can get support to make that possible. And of course that was the lifeline for a lot of American musicians throughout the whole history of jazz, really. They came to Europe and earned money. And then you have the social, political, it's so many aspects to that, of course, like the struggles of the black musicians and coming to Europe and was accepted. And there's many levels, but I say the general acceptance and also a financial stability made it possible in Europe much more than in the US. And that's really still how it is.
Yeah, I have the sense that free jazz especially has had more fertile ground in Europe, and Americans are more sort of bewildered by it. It doesn't seem to have the same support here that it has in Europe.
Yeah, it always really surprises me. And I realize that that's still the case. You have people like Ornette Coleman, for example, which basically revolutionized a lot of like the language and did his things, which in many ways his music is still looked up on being just weird and strange. Which is,
of course, he's from Texas.
Of course, yeah. The individual voices from, you have the Texas tenor tradition and all that. But the language in itself in the US, it's much more based, especially around in universities where you learn the language, where you learn the skills. Of course, there is just like basic skills you gotta learn, but then you also have the understanding of history that's so old, and it seems a little bit more stuck in a certain period, more than just like, well, that happened 70 years ago. A lot of other stuff happened, and Europe is probably a little bit more open, and they see the whole tradition more as an importance than just sticking to one part of it. But again, No, I'll just say, like, you have different places all around the world. Obviously, some schools, even if it's in the US or in Europe, are still conservative in terms of what they teach. But if you're going to be generalizing, yeah, I guess Europe is a little more open to that, more traditions.
John had mentioned Ornette Coleman. I had the distinct pleasure of going to some of his gigs over the years and
oh, wow.
experienced strange audience reactions. And I don't know if you've had the same experience where people are jazz, so they come in expecting Kenny G or or someone of that ilk. Right. And Ornette was definitely not that. And have you experienced that kind of people thinking you're something other than what you are and reacting negatively during a gig?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it kind of sometimes you feel like you preaching to the choir, because the venues and the audience in the US it's always like it's exciting and it's inspiring to tour in the US, because there is so much enthusiasm when people decide to start a club or present that kind of music. There's always a lot of support behind it, and enthusiasm and hard work to make it happen. So in those places you do this music, people really know what to expect, and they know what they're going for, and they have the knowledge, and they want to hear exactly what we do. But what I like to do is to try to mix audiences, which is one of the aspects of my festival. Like I'd love to see, for example, in Austin, a lot more of the jazz, like the people who's listening to more mainstream jazz, to come and also listen to free jazz, because the basics are so similar. It's the traditions are the same. I mean, this has been explored for decades already. It's time for people to see the commonalities and the differences. I mean, the similarities.
Well, you know, actually, I was just going to say, in Austin, there's not, and I think in many parts of the U.S., there's really not a huge audience for even traditional jazz. We had very little jazz here in Austin. And we had, I can't think, the last jazz festival here in Austin I can think of was UT sponsored. It was called the Longhorn Jazz Festival, and they stopped doing that.
Right.
So there's not really, outside of what you're doing with Sonic Transmissions and what Pedro's doing with Epistrophy Arts. Right. That's Pedro Moreno doing Epistrophy Arts, which just sort of coordinates and promotes a lot of free jazz performances in Austin. What you guys are working on is sort of like you're cultivating an audience. And I think you can almost leapfrog here, because, I mean, you can cultivate an audience where there was no traditional jazz audience before, and you can reach people who may have, you know, they're just sort of looking for something, but they're not coming from a jazz tradition. They may be coming from more of a, you know, like psychedelic music tradition or rock tradition. Maybe drawn through funk and fusion and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
It could be that a lot of this lack of jazz is a direct result of the media, especially music radio, music TV, being controlled by a very small number of people. And apparently there are very few jazz fans in the corporate offices of the 2 or 3 companies that basically control radio and TV, especially music programming.
Right. I think you're completely right. Yeah, of course, you need that help from the media, and you need also the help from presenters. Like, okay, Pedro, Moreno, and Epistrophy Arts is like one of the reasons I moved. I mean, one reason, because I knew Austin from before through Pedro. And I played there several times, and he's been doing this for 20 years. And you see the results he's been coming up with. He have an audience that trusts his programming, and they come to see. And they still have problem drawing jazz audience, which is to me mind-blowing. And then you have places like Elephant Room, and now recently a new place called Parker. and they draw a lot of people. There's people paying money to come and see jazz. But the problem I see a lot, even if those places are great and they do present jazz, the problem I see that they a lot of times underestimate their audiences. They think that audiences don't want to hear something that they believe is only going to scare people or going to think it's crazy or something, instead of showing audiences a fair amount of different traditions. If you're talking about what's been happening in jazz since the early days, and that's something I think it's a mistake presenters do. You cannot underestimate your audience, because people are going to go and see something live. It's a complete different thing, and I think it's so important to put something in front of an audience that they might not exactly expect or know about. Without, of course, I'm not talking about putting a complete minimal improv group at the Elephant Room or anything like that. It have to be something that have makes sense in what they try to present. But I think a lot of people could be a little more adventurous when presenting music, and I think that would make results. And then, of course, radio have a good amount of importance. Of course, I mean, people are actually listening to radio in the US, seems, or even more than in Europe in many ways. So yeah.
Austin should really be fertile ground, because we have this sort of evolving urbanization and a strong tradition of weirdness here, creative weirdness, and
yeah, exactly right.
And I think you like the audience is there, and you just have to find it in Austin. But I wonder about other parts of the U.S. I know you do some touring around the U.S. and what parts of the U.S. do you find the best response to your work?
I would say Chicago is probably the city for the music that's a little more experimental, but still have very, very strong connections to the jazz tradition. I mean, New York, obviously, but New York is such a big scene. So many musicians, it's incredible. I think that Chicago is more centered, it's more a community of musicians, which makes Chicago a really interesting place for the more adventurous music. At the same time, seems like there's more people from different scenes actually going to listen to each other and working together, both from more the traditional and not at least the avant-rock scene and the free jazz. It's been happening for a long time already. So yeah. But then you have LA. I find LA very interesting, but again, it's such a big city, so it's like 100 cities in one kind of thing.
Are there areas you've played where you were surprised at the response?
Oh yeah, many places. As I said earlier, like the presenters makes the difference. So you find those presenters everywhere in like any small city in the US. Like Columbia, North Carolina. I always mix that up. Yeah, that's one of the hippest places I know, because the presenter is just such a great guy and he gets such lots of different music and the audience comes out. So like that's the model. You see that everywhere. There's just like Pedro in Austin, like people who's been doing it for a long time, and people go and listen and the response is great. You sell tons of records and it's just great. So yeah, those exist everywhere.
How did you decide to do Sonic Transmissions? What's the origin of that festival?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting to talk about that now, because it was based upon one of the bands that I started when I moved to Texas, which is called the Young Mothers.
Oh yeah,
yeah. That was like an initial thing that brought me to do Sonic Transmissions, because I got access to the city grant, and I realized like, wow, okay, if I can apply for a grant and actually do a festival, what do I want to do? And my first thought was, well, I want to expose people to the musicians and the Young Mothers, because it is such a vast differences within the band, and so many traditions with musicians who's really doing all those things. It's not like we don't try to just fusion things for the fun of making fusion music, but it's actually it's a band consisting of members doing grindcore on a daily basis, doing hip hop on a daily basis, doing free jazz on a daily basis, working with pop music on a daily basis. It have and so when I got the thought that I can actually financially try to do a festival in Austin, I wanted to feature those different genres on that festival. So that was the start, really, in 2015.
And you have 3 years of sonic transmissions, right?
Yeah, I'm doing the fourth. This year is the fourth, but this is it's a different model. This time it's the series, five concerts during the year. So we call it Sonic Transmissions Presents.
And I think that has worked really well. It's similar to what's happened with some of the other festivals, like Levitation had a lot of success in moving away from one big festival in one big area and moving out to the clubs all at one time, though. And yours is spread out over the year, which I think is very interesting too.
Right. Yeah, no, it's kind of a mind bog to figure out how to draw audiences in Austin because of all the festivals, all the music that's happening all the time. So I figured I wanted to try to see if that would make a difference to spread it out instead of having it over the same 2-3 days. And so far, it really seemed to have made good results. We'll see what we got for next year.
It strikes me as a very wise decision because I had fairly long career in major event production in California.
Right.
And the economy of scale is a big limiting factor. When you have a really large gathering, a really large production, the costs tend to spiral out of control, whereas having smaller individual units, if you will, of production makes it a lot more affordable, a lot easier to sustain that kind of a model.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly what I'm definitely realizing too. Even if I like the festival concept because somehow it's a little more exciting and you can get all these artists gathered and it's a little bigger scale. But again, to draw people out for more than one night is almost impossible.
And then also, I've noticed a lot of the big festivals are more often encountering the not in my backyard syndrome, where people in the neighborhood, whatever area it is, really don't want to have a big event happening around their neighborhood. So producers are having to chase around and find new locations for a big event. Yeah,
that's another aspect, of course. And renting places in Austin, that's another thing, just having venues, getting venues. And there's a lot of logistical challenges around that.
Well, the success of South by Southwest caused escalation in the rental cost of venues. I know Plutopia experienced that back when we were doing the interactive closing party, and places that wanted to rent for a small amount of money suddenly became very expensive because all the big corporate parties started overpaying for these venues.
Well, in addition to the rent, you have the underwriters. Like, you have to insure your event, and the cost of insurance was increasing too.
Right. Yeah. No, that doesn't help.
Which is less of an issue, I think, in an established venue. But if you're doing sort of a one-off somewhere, you may have to spring for insurance. Maybe you don't have to if you're like working through clubs and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, it's like one example. I mean, I'm not gonna come too much into it, but it's just I really wanted to use Scudin for my festival last year, and I tried to set it up, and I checked what that would cost, and I won't even say how much. It's just
it was high.
It's insane. It's insane, and it doesn't allow local participant to do anything for anything else than super commercial music. So I don't see the reason, or what's the gain more than just financial gains, of course, which is probably the only gain.
Yeah, I mean, some of the venues, like I know somebody who works with one of the other larger venues here in town, and just kind of overhearing conversations he's had, I realized that they're sort of under the gun to, they have investors and they have to, they have to produce a crowd for every show. And if they produce a show that underperforms, their investors get really upset with them. So, it can be hard to program some of the larger venues with anything that is not kind of a sure thing, You really have to feel confident that you're going to be able to get the people out for it. So if it's something that's more avant-garde and experimental, of course, it's harder to get the venue for it.
Yeah, but even if it's not avant-garde and experimental, it's hard to get people out for anything. And I think that if you only count on financial income as a presenter, music is just going to go out the door immediately. That's
there's such thing as a like trusted venue, a venue where people trust that the shows that are booked there are going to be worthwhile to them, so they'll just go for the venue, not so much because they're attracted to the specific show. I mean, you got a bunch of those in Austin too. Like I think the Continental Club is always packed.
Oh, for sure. Right. Yeah, amazing. I like that place a lot.
And, they have occasionally done jazz shows there. I recall going to see Steve Lacy there.
He loved that place.
Yeah. And he always packed it, he always had a huge crowd.
Amazing. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I keep forgetting that. I think he was in Austin a lot back in the days and played the Continental Club.
Do you think the problem getting people out to events is due to the explosion of just the number of events? I mean, any weekend when you look in the look in the newspaper in the entertainment section, it's huge. There's 10K, 5K races, marathons, festivals of any sort, and it sounds like it's almost like a bubble, like the real estate market experience, where the things just kept growing and growing and became unsustainable. Do you think there has to be a point where there's a limit on the number of events that otherwise people will be able to draw 3 or 4 people to an event rather than several hundred?
Yeah, I think obviously it is, but what can you do? It's a good, in a way, it's a good problem. It's so much happening. It's amazing. It's incredible. But yeah, I mean, it can only, whenever you do anything in Austin, it seems like you are competing with something similar in whatever genre you're doing. So it's a challenge, but probably good challenge too. I don't know. And with the growing people coming to town and want to go and see things, it might change.
We keep hearing that jazz is dead. And I saw something recently that said that what the top selling jazz album is?
Right.
Is Kind of Blue.
Shit, yeah, still.
A 1959 jazz album, and it's still outselling contemporary jazz albums.
Yeah.
So, but do you get that sense? It seems to me, I mean, I see there's a lot of sort of like jazz that is less creative, certainly jazz that is more like light jazz, mainstream kind of stuff and so forth. But it also seems to me that it's kind of like morphing all over the place and combining a lot with other forms. The Young Mothers being a great example where, you've got jazz combined with hip hop and rock, just kind of heavy rhythms. And at the same time, you're sort of like ascending and descending and kind of traveling all over the place with your music. But how do you see that? Do you have a sense that there's a lot of stuff going on that's really very interesting within jazz, or does it seem to be sort of mordant to you in general, with just a few areas where it's kind of exploding?
Yeah, it's a hard question. Like, I like to, somebody got asked about if jazz is dead, and they said, it's not dead, it just smells funny. That was one of the old guys saying. That was a while ago, really. But it's hard to say. I think something is happening that is new these days around because just of the access, the information access, and the kids today who's studying music, they come in with a complete different attitude towards the music and the possibilities that I think and ever been happening. And like, you listen to all kinds of stuff, and why wouldn't you just use a lot of input from a lot of different music to make your music? And I think that happens more and more around. Like, on the contrary, I think a lot of people study jazz, and they think that they need to reproduce jazz that was already made, because that's the only thing people want to listen to. And I think the fact that Kind of Blue is still the best-selling album says a lot and answers that question. It's probably not the best solution. You got to try to push it forward, and then people are gonna become like, what is that? Yeah, that's the obvious reaction to something that's a little different. And people are too afraid, I think, to both musicians, presenters, and audience to just go that step. But I see a lot of that happening around, both in the US and in Europe. Like, you meet like musicians with incredible skills that do stuff that's incredible. It's just going to take a while to find a path to make sense of it, maybe. And there is definitely stuff happening all around, really, in the newer generation, and it'll be very interesting to see what's there in like 5-10 years or whatever, like sooner maybe or later. I don't know.
I think the whole genre thing is kind of loose now anyway. It's sort of hard to, I mean, you hear things that have a jazz feel to them, but they're not really considered part of the jazz genre, but they're, may have like strong improvisational parts and that sort of thing.
It's a bit it's kind of like Darwin applied to music. It's evolution.
Yeah.
Things aren't always going to appear and sound and be the same. They have to either improve or die.
Yeah, it's true. And I'm one of those that believe that jazz is still alive, because I feel like jazz, the core of jazz is really the improvisation. And you can also say, and that a lot of people would argue to say, if jazz, it have to swing. And somehow I can even agree to that. I love doing thing that swings, and I think that most music, even if it's not like in the traditional way, like swings like people think of how that should be, it needs to be a forward movement, and people have that history knowledge and that idea of what that means, and I think that's still happening. I think a lot of music today, you can still call it jazz, but there is a million opinions about that, and it doesn't really matter in the end of the day. But
if you go on YouTube and just search under jazz, you'll come up with things from the turn of the 20th century, the 1920s, 1930s, and that sounds way different from, say, Jerry Mulligan, Stan Getz period, or Miles Davis, and then you move forward to this time, and it sounds different. It's just evolution of, but it's still called jazz.
Yeah, that's true. And it's also interesting to see reviewer critics through the time, like how the critics was reacting to, let's say, when John Coltrane was going a little freer, still doing his like very traditional things in today's terms, but at that time the critics was going nuts, saying like, this is bullshit, this is not music, blah blah blah. And you see the reactions like through the time, and still today that you can see that. So now it's many factors, and some people are, I guess, more open, and some are still really like conservatively close to just one period of what is considered jazz.
It was kind of interesting to me to go. I went to a concert a few months ago here in Austin. Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter, just those two together. It was one of the most interestingly strange concerts I've been to. They
Amazing.
were totally out there. In other words, they just weren't resting on their laurels. They weren't playing
Exactly. Yeah.
the easy stuff that, I mean, there's some things that they're known for that are pretty accessible, but
Yeah.
they were into really strange combinations, and
Amazing.
And they were experimenting. They were experimenting in front of this. They had a huge audience, big ticket audience,
Right.
and they were totally just improvising and experimenting. And it's sort of great
amazing.
to see that in guys who are still, I mean, they're so well established as jazz musicians.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, well, go ahead. What did you say?
No, you said that I heard them in 2015 in Middelheim at the festival in Belgium, and I had the exact same experience. Like some audience even left. It was a huge audience, and they were expecting hearing footprints and the classic,
Yeah.
And they didn't get it. And they were just, I guess they were also like the synthesizer part of, they were really out there. Fantastic. Wow.
Well, I have one other very compelling question
All right.
about sort of how, especially in your experience, how bands work, how they self-organize. I mean, we hear about the idea of like there's a band leader and he's sort of leading the band, and it's sort of like the old school sense of Duke Ellington. It was sort of like completely the leader and orchestrate everything, but have a really strong sense, especially in some of your bands. You guys aren't doing anything like that. You seem to be really sort of self-organizing. And you know that I'm very interested in the cooperative tradition. So I'm getting a sense that there's like a really collective and cooperative thing going on, but I'm never quite sure about how that's getting worked out. Like when you take the stage and you're with the whole band there, sort of how are decisions made about where you're going with improvisation and where you're going with the more structured pieces and that sort of thing?
Well, first, like it may be one thing that's interesting in terms of defining the differences of European and American musicians. You can easily see that in how bands often are organized. Like if most of the bands I know, or maybe that's not true anymore, but a lot at least of the US bands, jazz bands, it's always like there's a leader, more or less. It feels like that's how it's done. But while in Europe, it's maybe the approach is more like a democratic process. And a lot of the bands I work in are definitely worked out as a democratic band. We all are leaders in a way, and musically, I mean, it depends on, are you doing completely free improvised? Are you doing compositions, or are you doing this or that? So also there, most of the bands I'm playing in, we know a lot about where we're going, and if it's compositional based, even if it's a lot of improvisation, we know exactly when the improvisations are coming, and so there is a process that we are well aware of. So while if you go on the stage as a complete improvised group, of course, then it's improvised, you don't know. So it's a different process again. So it really depends on what are the band built on, like what kind of structure, compositional or total free. It's many aspects to that for sure, and how the differences between the US and European musicians. I can also say that because I worked with a lot of US musicians that's both based in the improvisation or in the composition, so you really learn to know the different approaches, and they are quite different, I would say.
Do you find a comfort in one type or another? I mean, what are you most comfortable with, the European approach or the more structured American artist approach?
Well, I mean, it's still, I feel like the European, the democratic model or whatever is still structured. It's just like there's less of like there's one leader that, kind of thing. While I don't know if what I like more or less, it's interesting both, I think, and it depends on the people all the time. I mean, obviously, if you work with a guy or a woman that is like kind of not cool to work with, and they are the leaders, then that's not cool. And that happens a lot, of course. I mean, it depends on people. So I can like both, as long as I like the people, really. There's a lot of social aspects to that too, how you work in the group, obviously. So yeah, no, it's complex, I guess.
I think one way to think about a more democratic way of doing things is this idea of like, maybe you have a conversation going and somebody has a stick or something that they pass around, so that the person who's holding the stick is the person who gets to talk. And it's like, in democracy, it's not that you don't have leaders, but you're, in that same sense, sort of passing the leadership around. Different people can take leadership roles in different contexts. So maybe if it's a piece you wrote, you have more influence over the way it's performed, that sort of thing. But it's not in the sense of like Duke Ellington, like there's one guy who decides how everything goes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Or Miles, I'm it would be fascinated to hear more about how Miles worked with his bands, because he really there seemed to be a sense that he was pretty dominant in all of his configurations, but at the same time, pretty generous about it, and that they were fairly democratic in a sense, and things did get passed around.
Yeah.
That might have been kind of a hybrid model, I guess.
Yeah, wow. Miles is such a good example, like how he moved from thing to thing, and it always seemed like he, at least maybe from the 60s and up, like he picked persons, like the individuals he worked with, like with the abilities that he wanted, more than just necessarily like a saxophone player that could play bebop, or like the persons he played with were part of the process and were opening the music up, like the quintet, like the later quintet is one of my absolute favorite, like the Live at the Plug Nickel and all that.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Like the music is so free, and you hear like everybody's just they have the freedom to basically do anything, but up on certain frames and rules, of course, because they were still playing those songs. But he's a very interesting example on how somebody were a very clear leader, but also he wanted it to be much more democratic than any bands that was happening at that time, for sure. And that made a huge impact in Europe, for sure. I mean, everywhere, of course, but like that kind of, I remember people talked about seeing like his later bands and how that made impressions and how that made people to do what they do now and then.
So as we get kind of to the end of our conversation, what are you working on now? What are you excited about right now?
Well, I'm on tour in Europe. I mean, I'm starting a tour tomorrow. I'm a recording session with Atomic, 2 days, and then we're touring Scandinavia, 3 gigs around, which I always love to play with Atomic, so that's going to be cool. Then I'm going back to Austin, and I'm super stoked, of course, because we are preparing the second release for the Young Mothers album. Is coming out now in May in Europe and June in the US. So we're gonna rehearse and do a few Texas gigs. We're playing actually in Austin on the
May 20th.
Yeah, and the 19th at the Austin Jukebox.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't see that one. Okay, good.
Yeah, there's another one. It's going to be great. And Mohawk on the 20th. And we play in Dallas on the 17th. And then we start like a 2-week Europe tour on the 29th. So we're getting together now next week to reconnect and rehearse and get our things together. So that's, of course, I can't wait for that. It's been a while since we played. And we are all such good friends too. So socially, it's just such a trip to meet.
Well, thank you very much for taking time with us today.
Thank you.
And speaking with us across continents.
We look forward to having you on again.
I would love to. Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Learn more about Ingebright by going to ingebritflaten.com or check out his music on Bandcamp. You can go to ingebritflaten.bandcamp.com. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney, and this is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.